Welcome to a world before limits existed, before sensors, before rules, before mercy. These trucks were built raw, brutal, unstoppable. No emissions, no compromise, just iron. Modern engineers can't recreate them. This isn't nostalgia, it's forbidden power. Number 1. Kenworth W900A, the 70s long hood legend. By the 1970s, the Kenworth W900A had already become the template for what many drivers still picture when they imagine an American big rig: long hood, tall stacks, heavy frame rails, and a stance that looks like it was built to pull a mountain. Kenworth's own history and model documentation trace the W900 family's long run, with the W900A era spanning 1965 to 1982, meaning the 1970s were right in its prime. What made a 70s W900A pre-emission in the way people mean it wasn't a single magic part, it was the whole ecosystem. Big-bore diesels were predominantly mechanical. Throttle cables, mechanical governors, and service procedures that lived in the hands of good mechanics rather than laptop sessions. The truck's packaging also reflected a different philosophy. You had space for massive radiators and charge air routing without needing modern aero shaping. Even the sleeper evolution tells the story. Kenworth introduced factory sleeper options and later the Aerodyne concept, raised roof sleeper, during the W900A era, aimed at driver livability without turning the truck into a wind tunnel sculpture. Why can't modern engineers replicate it? They could absolutely build a long-nose conventional with a heavy frame. What they can't replicate is selling that same silhouette with the same mechanical simplicity and lack of after-treatment while meeting modern emissions regimes. And even if regulations vanish tomorrow, fleet buyers would still demand the aero and efficiency advantages that the W900A never chased, because fuel costs and compliance penalties changed the market. The W900A is the perfect example of a truck that wasn't better engineered than today's, just engineered for a world that no longer exists. Number 2. Peterbilt 359. The 70s status symbol. You could wrench forever. If the W900A is the Kenworth icon, the Peterbilt 359 is the Peterbilt counterpart, arguably the single most mythologized long hood conventional of its era. Peterbilt introduced the Model 359 in 1967, and it became a defining highway tractor through the 1970s, with production widely cited as running through The 70s 359 was the kind of truck that encouraged ownership pride. Long hood meant room for big cooling, big power options, and service access that didn't punish you for doing work the old-fashioned way. It also represented something modern engineering rarely targets: a platform designed to be customized, repowered, re-geared, and cosmetically personalized over decades. You could spec big sleepers, tall stacks, and the kind of heavy trim that made the truck feel like a rolling identity, not just a tool. The pre-emission character shows up in the way these trucks ran and were maintained. Mechanical fueling didn't require an emissions strategy to manage particulate filters or NOx reduction systems. If something was off, you diagnosed it by sound, smoke, boost behavior, fuel delivery, and hands-on inspection, skills that still matter today, but that are now layered beneath electronics and software logic. Modern engineers can't replicate the 359 for the same reason they can't replicate a 70s muscle car as a brand new carbureted daily driver. You could recreate the shape, but you can't recreate the compliance-free environment. Even the market incentives changed. Today, the buyers with the biggest influence are often fleets optimizing fuel burn and uptime data. 359 was built for a culture where a driver might keep the same truck for a working lifetime and rebuild the heart of it multiple times. That forever truck mindset is the rare ingredient you can't CAD model back into existence. Number 3. GMC Astro 95. The cabover brute built for real work. The GMC Astro is one of the most important American cabovers ever built, and the 1970s were right in the middle of its reign. The model is documented as being manufactured from the 1969 to 1987 model years, placing the 70s squarely in its most common era on highways and in heavy haul service. Cabovers were popular for practical reasons: maximizing trailer length within overall length laws, improving maneuverability in tighter terminals, and giving drivers a commanding forward view. The Astro delivered that with a brutally straightforward approach. Tilt cab for access, big drivetrain options, and a chassis that didn't pretend to be delicate. Historical summaries also note that GM ultimately discontinued the Astro by 1987, tied to GM's shifting strategy and later the Volvo-GM joint venture era. Another sign that the industry itself pivoted away from what cabovers represented in North America. What makes the Astro pre-emission in spirit is how much of its performance story was purely mechanical: engine choice, gearing, cooling, and driver technique. No after-treatment architecture to package, no modern emissions calibrations trying to juggle competing targets. You sized the machine to do the job, and then you lived with the fuel burn. Why can't modern engineers replicate it? They can build cabovers. Europe proves that daily, but replicating the Astro's exact mechanical simplicity and its tolerance for long-term brute service would collide with modern requirements. Cab structural standards, crash performance expectations, electronics integration, and of course emission systems all push design in new directions. Even if you keep the cabover layout, you no longer get to keep the simple, huge, serviceable, mechanical everything approach that defined a 70s American COE like the Astro. Number 4. International Transstar 2 COE 70s cabover with big road attitude. International Harvester's Transstar line is a major chapter in American COE history, and the Transstar 2 is one of its most recognizable 1970s faces. Reference listings show Transstar 2 CO4070 series spanning roughly the late 1960s into the early 1980s, with the Transstar 2 name associated with mid-70s updates. The Transstar 2 mattered because it wasn't just a generic cabover. It was part of a competitive era where CO4070s had to be comfortable enough for serious miles, while still being compact enough to maximize legal length. The layout gave you tilt cab access and a forward driving position that felt very different from a long hood conventional. In the 1970s, that configuration was often the practical choice, not the niche one. The pre-emission identity here is mostly about the drivetrain environment of the time. You could run classic diesel options paired with transmissions built around human skill, and the truck's day-to-day reality was dominated by mechanical reliability, cooling performance, and parts availability, not by emission sensors, dosing systems, or regeneration cycles. Modern engineers can't replicate this exact recipe because the recipe requires a design goal that modern buyers rarely demand, a cabover built around long-term rebuild culture rather than around aerodynamics, electronics integration, and compliance packaging. Today's COEs, where common, are engineered to be efficient, safe, and emissions-compliant first. The Transstar 2 era COE was engineered to be workable first, easy access, hard frames, and a mechanical soul that could be kept alive in small shops. That combination is historically specific, and that's why it's so hard to replicate honestly. Number 5. Kenworth K100. The 70s COE that proved cabovers could be premium. Kenworth's K100 is the cabover sibling to the W900's long hood identity. Kenworth introduced the W900 and the K-Series cabover in the early 1960s, and the K100 line remained a serious presence for decades, with North American production continuing into the early 2000s. That long lifespan matters because it shows how right the K100 concept was for a wide range of operators, and in the 1970s, it was absolutely in the sweet spot. A 70s K100 offered something special: COE practicality with premium spec ambition. Kenworth's brand identity, build quality, heavy-duty focus, customization, carried into the cabover format. So you got a truck that could be spec'd for hard miles without feeling like an economy choice. Kenworth's own historical notes even highlight K100 visibility in heavy-haul moments, reflecting the model's reputation for serious work. Pre-emission character shows up in how these trucks were built to be worked on. Tilt cab access is an engineering statement. You're going to service this thing often, and we want that to be possible in the real world. The rest of the package, big cooling, mechanical powertrains, frames designed for long lives, fits the same philosophy. Why can't modern engineers replicate it? Again, it's not that they lack skill, it's that they'd be designing into a market that punishes the exact priorities that made the K100 beloved: tall frontal area, aero penalty, heavy build, weight and cost, and a simplicity that doesn't align with modern compliance demands. A modern K100-inspired truck would inevitably be reshaped, softened, and electronically reimagined, meaning it wouldn't actually be the 70s K100 experience people are nostalgic for. Number 6. Freightliner FLT COE. The late 70s transition machine. Freightliner's cabover story in the 1970s is deeply tied to industry consolidation and evolving model families. One documented example is the Freightliner FLT series, listed with production years roughly 1976, positioned as a successor-era COE family in the late 1970s. That makes it a perfect 70s pre-emission pick. It represents the era's cab-over logic while still being close enough to the decade to carry the old-school mechanical DNA. The late 70s were a time when trucks were becoming more standardized in some ways. Parts families, production methods. But they still hadn't crossed into the fully electronic age. So an FLT-era COE still lived in the world of mechanical fueling, human-centered driving technique, and maintenance culture built around physical access. COE packaging also meant the driveline layout had to be robust and practical, because the truck's job wasn't to look sleek, it was to haul, survive, and be serviceable. Why can't modern engineers replicate it? Modern Freightliner engineering can build better trucks by many metrics: safety, efficiency, diagnostics, and emissions performance. But the FLT's appeal, its mechanical straightforwardness, and keep it alive forever service mindset would clash with the modern product environment. A 2026 truck must integrate emissions hardware, modern electrical architecture, and a cab structure designed around today's crash and ergonomics expectations. That's a different machine, even if you copy the old silhouette. In other words, the FLT is a reminder that 1970s trucks weren't primitive. They were optimized for a world where a driver's hands and a mechanic's skill were the primary control systems. Today, the control systems are also software, and that shift is irreversible for any new truck sold at scale. Number 7. Mack R Series. The bulldog workhorse of 70s hauling. Mack's R Series is one of the defining American heavy truck platforms, introduced in 1965 and evolving through the 1970s with major real-world impact. In the 70s, R models were everywhere: construction, regional haul, vocational work, and plenty of highway miles. The R Series mattered because it represented a durable, standardized approach to heavy trucking without giving up the mechanical feel that drivers respected. A key part of the R model identity in that era was Mack's emphasis on integrated drivetrains and practical engineering. The sources around the R Series history highlight the platform's design evolution, including cab updates and powertrain developments that aimed at drivability and efficiency for the time. Even without turning this into an engine-by-engine history lesson, the takeaway is simple. The R model was built in the era where you could engineer for durability first and let a skilled operator do the rest. What makes it pre-emission in the way enthusiasts mean is that the truck's performance and reliability were not intertwined with after-treatment systems. The engine made power, the cooling system kept it alive, the transmission and rear ends delivered it, and the driver managed it. When something went wrong, the diagnostic path wasn't hidden behind layers of sensors and fault trees. Modern engineers can't replicate the R model experience because modern trucks must be engineered as integrated emission systems as much as they are transportation machines. That doesn't make modern trucks worse, it makes them different. The R model is from the period where the truck's personality was the sum of mechanical choices in human operation. Today, personality is also shaped by software strategy, compliance limits, and standardized fleet procurement. That's why a true 1970s-style Mack R, as new, isn't something the modern industry is set up to produce. Number 8. Western Star. Autocar Cab Era. 70s bruisers. You could spec for punishment. Western Star's roots in the late 1960s and 1970s are tied to White Motor Corporation, and sources describe how early Western Star trucks often used cabs from sister company Autocar. That detail matters because it points to a specific era of heavy truck engineering: modular cab sharing, extremely stout vocational intentions, and a willingness to prioritize strength and serviceability over mass-market polish. In the 1970s, Western Star was building a reputation for severe-duty toughness. These were trucks that operators wanted when routes, loads, or terrain were unforgiving. The Autocar driver cab lineage frequently comes up in historical discussion of this era, reflecting an approach where the cab itself was a long-lived industrial component rather than a rapidly changing consumer-style cockpit. Why does this matter for the modern engineers can't replicate theme? Because severe-duty trucking today is still severe duty, but the constraints are different. Modern vocational trucks are packed with electronics, emission systems, and safety features that add complexity and change packaging. A 1970s Western Star could be built around a brutally direct structure-first philosophy. You could choose heavy frames, big cooling, and straightforward mechanical powertrains without needing to reserve space and thermal management strategy for modern aftertreatment. You can still buy tough trucks today, but you can't buy a new truck that feels like a 1970s Western star. Minimal electronics, purely mechanical driveline logic, and a cab built as a long-term industrial shell that you'll keep for decades. That isn't a lack of capability, it's a mismatch with modern compliance, cost structures, and what mainstream buyers are willing to pay for per-unit hand-built heaviness. Number 9. Autocar DC. The severe-duty DNA that defined an era. Autocar's DC name is deeply historic. Autocar itself states that the DC conventional was first introduced in 1939, and historical summaries note the DC line's long influence across decades. While the DC lineage spans far beyond the 1970s, that decade was very much within the period when Autocar-style severe-duty conventional thinking shaped real fleets, rugged frames, service-minded layouts, and a design culture focused on vocational punishment. This is where replication becomes especially hard to explain to modern audiences. A 1970s Autocar DC-era truck wasn't trying to be aerodynamic art, it was trying to be the machine you keep running in the worst conditions with the least drama. Construction sites, refuse duty, heavy vocational cycles where durability beats glamour every day of the week. That is the purest form of industrial truck design. What makes that pre-emission? The same theme returns: mechanical fueling, no after-treatment packaging, and a maintenance environment where the truck's survival depended on access and rebuildability. You could rebuild engines and driveline components as a normal part of life. The truck was an asset you renewed, not a device you replaced at a planned endpoint. Autocar's own historical material underscores how DC has been a core identity across time, and the fact that the name was later reborn in modern times highlights the nostalgia and demand. But a reborn DC today is still a modern emissions-compliant truck. It cannot be a true 1970s-style pre-emission machine because the entire regulatory and industrial ecosystem no longer allows that exact combination of simplicity, packaging freedom, and mechanical purity. Number 10. White-Freightliner WFT era COEs. A 70s staple of American cab-over freight. White-Freightliner is a name that instantly signals a specific period in American trucking history, and documented model listings identify the WFT White-Freightliner cab-over era with production years roughly 1958–1976, meaning the early and mid-1970s are right at the end of that classic run. That makes it a perfect 70s pre-emission inclusion. It's literally the closing chapter of an era, before industry shifts and model family transitions reshape the market. These WFT-era cabovers were built for freight reality, tight terminals, length laws, and the need to squeeze maximum utility out of every inch. They represent the old logic where the cabover wasn't a compromise, it was the dominant configuration in many fleets. And because of the time period, they also represent mechanical simplicity before the industry crossed into heavy electronic control architectures. Modern engineers can replicate cabovers as a concept, but they can't replicate this exact American cabover ecosystem. North America largely shifted toward conventionals for a mix of reasons: driver preference, ride quality, service practices, and changing regulations and market economics. Building a brand new 1974-style White-Freightliner cabover, mechanical, simple, rebuildable, would run into modern requirements immediately, even before you consider whether the market would buy enough of them to justify production. The WFT-era trucks are like industrial fossils in the best way. They preserve the design priorities of a time when the trucking industry's constraints and incentives were fundamentally different. That's why they feel impossible to recreate. Not because modern engineers are weaker, but because modern reality is stricter. These trucks were loud, dirty, and unstoppable. They didn't ask permission. They just worked. The world moved on, but these never surrendered, because real power doesn't evolve, it endures.